You believe you're witnessing the world. You truly believe you're witnessing the world. Colors, objects, outlines, depth, movement, illumination, and darkness. You think you're hearing sounds, melodies, voices, commotion, stillness. You think you're making contact with what's real, feeling surfaces, force, heat, ache, delight. You assume your senses provide you with unfiltered entry to what exists, to actual reality, to the universe exactly as it is, unmediated, unaltered, truthful. But that's not what's happening. You have never witnessed reality. You've never reached out and touched it, never listened to it, never undergone it firsthand. Every single thing you notice, every single thing you go through, every hue, every noise, every sensation, every object, every instant, all of it is assembled, produced, fabricated by your nervous system from incoming sensory impulses, from electrical messages, from sequences of neural firing that your brain interprets, sorts, and reshapes into the smooth, conscious flow you label as seeing the world, as undergoing experience, as sensing what is truly there. Yet that is not reality. It is a blueprint, a depiction, a simulated environment built by your brain using incomplete data, using ingrained heuristics, using processing tactics refined by natural selection, not designed for correctness, not designed for precision, not designed to reveal existence as it genuinely is, but for endurance, for procreation, for actions that keep you alive long enough to transmit your genes, no more, no less. And this fine-tuning, this evolutionary sculpting produced a sensory apparatus, a conscious encounter that feels like unfiltered entry to what's real, that feels instantaneous, unprocessed, self-evident, accurate, when in truth it's assembled, screened, streamlined, optimized for utility rather than correctness, for endurance rather than truth. This isn't abstract philosophy, not speculation, not mysticism. This is neuroscience, cognitive research, physics, information theory, all pointing toward the same unsettling conclusion. That consciousness never accesses reality directly, never perceives the world exactly as it is, only undergoes models, depictions, interpretations, constructions assembled by brains from incomplete data, using algorithms that evolved for survival in specific surroundings. On one planet, within one limited range of conditions where specific perceptual tactics were advantageous, were adaptive, were chosen not because they uncovered truth, but because they enabled reproduction, enabled survival, enabled genes to persist while concealing truth, while simplifying existence, while generating illusions that function better than accuracy would. I've devoted my career to investigating the deepest scaffolding of reality, quantum behavior, space-time, information, the link between observer and observed, and one fact has become impossible to escape, impossible to deny, profoundly disturbing. Reality bears no resemblance to perception, no resemblance to experience, no resemblance to what consciousness shows you. The universe uncovered by physics, by careful experimentation, by mathematical scrutiny, by stripping away human intuition and biological bias, that universe is radically unlike the universe of immediate experience, of sensory perception, of what brains construct and label as reality, so different that human intuition fails entirely, becomes worse than useless, becomes actively deceptive, because intuition evolved for survival, for hunting, for gathering, for social navigation, not for grasping quantum fields or space-time curvature or the fundamental architecture of existence, not for truth, never for truth, only for reproductive success in ancestral settings. Let me walk you through what your brain is genuinely doing, how perception genuinely operates, and why you have never, not once in your entire life, not even for a single split second, directly experienced objective reality. Start with vision, with color, because here the constructive essence of perception becomes undeniable, impossible to overlook. Color does not exist in the universe, not as a quality of light, not as a characteristic of objects, not as a dimension of reality independent of observers. Color is made, generated, built by your brain from wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation, from photons hitting your retina, from signals processed through your visual cortex to generate the experience of red, blue, yellow, green, experiences that exist nowhere except in consciousness, inside the constructed model your brain builds, inside the perceptual representation that feels like seeing reality but is actually seeing interpretation. Light has wavelength, frequency, energy, physical traits, measurable, objective, but it does not have color. Color is what your brain does with that information, how it symbolizes different wavelengths, how it generates subjective experience, qualia, the redness of red, the blueness of blue. These exist only within consciousness, only within the model your brain constructs. Not in reality, not in the electromagnetic radiation, not in the photons, not in the physical world independent of observers. And this becomes obvious once you reflect on it, once you realize that different organisms perceive color differently. Bees see ultraviolet, snakes see infrared, dogs see fewer colors. Mantis shrimp see more colors, many more, with 12 types of photoreceptors instead of 3. Perceiving distinctions humans cannot, experiencing colors humans cannot imagine, cannot fathom, because human brains lack the receptors, lack the neural equipment, lack the processing needed to create those experiences, those qualia, those colors that exist for mantis shrimp but not for humans. Not because human eyes are defective, but because color is constructed, is representation, is how brains encode information about wavelength, and different brains encode it differently, create different experiences, different qualia, different colors from the same physical light. So, when you see red, you are not seeing a property of the object, you are not seeing the light itself. You are undergoing your brain's representation, your brain's encoding, your brain's way of informing you about a particular wavelength, about photons in a certain energy range, that your photoreceptors detected, that your visual cortex processed, that resulted in the neural pattern your consciousness interprets as red, as that specific experience, that specific quale that feels immediate, direct, like a feature of the world, when actually it is a feature of your brain, of your perceptual system, of the model your consciousness builds from sensory input. And it's not just color, it's everything visual, shape, depth, motion, object boundaries, all constructed, all interpretation. Your retina receives two-dimensional patterns of light, flat images, and your brain constructs three-dimensional space, constructs objects, constructs depth and distance and solidity using cues, using assumptions, using processing algorithms that are mostly unconscious, mostly automatic, mostly operating without your awareness, generating a seamless experience, generating the feeling of seeing a three-dimensional world, of perceiving objects in space, when actually you're seeing reconstruction, interpretation, a model built from two-dimensional input using assumptions about how the world works, about what patterns of light usually mean, about how to translate retinal images into spatial representation. And this process makes mistakes, creates illusions, optical illusions where the brain's assumptions fail, where processing algorithms produce wrong interpretations, wrong constructions, wrong perceptions. You see motion that isn't there, see colors that don't exist, see shapes that contradict measurements, all because your brain is constructing, is interpreting, is building a model. And sometimes the model is wrong, sometimes the construction fails, sometimes the algorithms produce outputs that don't match external reality, revealing that perception is not direct, not immediate, not showing you reality as it is, but showing you interpretation, construction, a model that usually works, that usually enables survival, but occasionally fails, occasionally creates illusions, occasionally unveils the constructive nature of all perception, not just illusions, but everything you see, everything you experience visually, all of it constructed, all of it interpretation, all of it a model rather than reality. Let me talk about sound now, because sound is even more obviously constructed, even more clearly not a property of reality, but a property of consciousness, of how brains represent information about pressure waves, about vibrations in air, about the mechanical disturbances that your auditory system detects, converts to neural signals, processes into experience, into the sensation of hearing, of sound, of music and speech and noise, all created by your brain, all representations, all models, all existing nowhere except in consciousness. The universe contains pressure waves, vibrations, molecules oscillating, generating patterns of compression and rarefaction, propagating through matter, through air, through water, through solids. These are physical, objective, real, but they do not make sound, they do not create noise, they do not produce music, they are just mechanical vibrations, just pressure changes, just molecules moving. Sound is what your brain does with information about these vibrations, how it represents them, how it generates conscious experience, how it builds sensation from signals from the cochlea, from hair cells detecting vibrations, from neural processing creating the experience of hearing, of sound, of something that seems to exist outside in the world, but actually exists only inside, in consciousness, in the model your brain builds. And like color, different organisms experience sound differently, hear different frequencies, create different representations. Dogs hear higher frequencies, elephants hear lower frequencies. Bats use echolocation, creating detailed spatial maps from sound, from echoes, from timing and intensity of reflected pressure waves, experiencing sound in ways humans cannot imagine. Because human brains don't process sound that way, don't create those representations, don't build those models. They have a different auditory system, different processing, different conscious experience of the same physical vibrations. So when you hear music, you are not hearing something in the world. You are undergoing your brain's representation of pressure wave patterns. Patterns your auditory system detected, converted to neural signals, processed through auditory cortex, integrated with memory, with emotion, with learned associations, creating the experience of music, of melody and harmony and rhythm, of beauty, of meaning, all created by your brain, all construction, all model, all interpretation of physical vibrations using algorithms shaped by evolution, by development, by experience, by culture, creating subjective experience, qualia, the sound of sound, the experience of hearing that exists only in consciousness, only in the model, only in the representation your brain builds, not in the pressure waves themselves, not in external reality, not in the universe independent of observers. Now let me talk about time, about temporal perception, about how your brain constructs the experience of time flowing, of moments passing, of duration, of sequence. Because time perception is also constructed, also created by the brain, also not a direct experience of reality, but interpretation, model, representation built from information about change, about events, about processes, using algorithms that generate the illusion of continuous flow, of smooth passage, of a present moment advancing through time, when actually perception is discontinuous, sampled, reconstructed, created by brain processing that takes time, creates delays, builds a model from information that arrived at different moments, from different sources, all integrated, all synchronized, all processed into a unified experience that feels immediate, continuous, direct, when actually it's delayed, constructed, built from pieces, assembled into a coherent model that consciousness experiences as the present moment, as now, as a continuous flow of time, all constructed, all interpretation, all model rather than direct reality. Your brain receives sensory information from different modalities at different speeds. Visual information arrives relatively quickly, auditory information faster, touch information faster still. Each modality processes at different rates, generating signals at different times. That should create a perception of events being non-simultaneous, should create an experience of temporal smearing, of events from different senses occurring at different moments, but you don't experience this. You don't perceive these delays. You don't notice the asynchrony because your brain compensates, adjusts, synchronizes, creates a unified temporal experience, binding information from different senses, different sources, different processing speeds into a single coherent moment, a single unified now that feels immediate, direct, true, when actually it's constructed, delayed, assembled from information that arrived and was processed at different times, all hidden by your brain, all compensated for, all adjusted to create the illusion of unity, of immediacy, of direct experience of the present moment, when the present moment is actually constructed, modeled, represented, not perceived directly, not experienced as it is, but as your brain interprets it, as consciousness constructs it from delayed information, from asynchronous inputs, from processing that takes time, generating an experience that feels timeless, immediate, present, when actually it's past, processed, constructed, a model rather than reality. And duration perception, the experience of how long something takes, how much time passes, is also constructed, also variable, also dependent on brain state, on attention, on emotion, on context. Time feels different when you're afraid, when you're bored, when you're engrossed. Same physical duration, same number of seconds measured by clocks, but different subjective experience, different perceived length, different feeling of how long it took. All because the brain is constructing duration, is modeling time, is creating an experience that depends not just on physical time, but on internal state, on processing, on how many events were experienced, how much information was processed, how attention was allocated, all creating subjective time, psychological time, experience duration that can expand or contract, speed up or slow down relative to clock time, relative to physical time, relative to objective duration, because the experience of time is constructed, is a model, is a representation, not direct perception of time itself, not immediate access to temporal reality, but interpretation, construction, a model built by the brain using information about change, about events, about processes, creating the feeling of time flowing, of duration passing, of moments advancing, all constructed, all interpretation, all existing in consciousness rather than in external reality. Let me talk about predictive processing now, about the modern neuroscience understanding of how perception actually works, because this reveals most clearly, most undeniably, that perception is not bottom-up, not sensory data creating experience, but top-down. The brain predicts, constructs, creates models, and uses sensory data only to adjust, to correct, to update predictions, not to create experience directly, but to modify an ongoing construction, an ongoing model, an ongoing simulation that your brain continuously runs, continuously updates, continuously adjusts based on prediction errors, on differences between what the brain expects and what sensors detect, creating perception as continuous construction, continuous prediction, continuous model building, rather than passive reception of sensory information. Your brain is constantly predicting, constantly modeling, constantly simulating what's likely to be out there, what's likely to happen next, based on experience, on memory, on learned patterns, on statistical regularities in the environment. And most of perception is this prediction, this model, this simulation, with sensory data playing a minor role, a corrective role, an updating role, adjusting predictions when they're wrong, when something unexpected happens, when a prediction error occurs. But most of the time, most of experience, most of perception is the prediction itself, the model itself, the simulation itself that your brain generates, that consciousness experiences, that feels like seeing reality, hearing reality, experiencing reality directly, when actually you are experiencing your brain's model, your brain's prediction, your brain's simulation of what's probably out there based on the past, on experience, on learned expectations, with reality playing only a corrective role, an error signal, an updating mechanism, adjusting the model, but not creating the experience, not generating the perception, not being the thing consciousness accesses. This is why expectations affect perception, why you see what you expect to see, hear what you expect to hear, experience what you predict will be there, because perception is largely prediction, is mostly model, is predominantly what the brain expects rather than what sensors detect. And when prediction is strong, when expectation is powerful, you can perceive things that aren't there, can miss things that are there, can experience illusions, hallucinations, misperceptions, all because perception is constructed, is top-down, is dominated by prediction rather than sensory input, by model rather than data, by brain simulation rather than external reality. And this makes evolutionary sense, makes computational sense, makes practical sense. Building complete perception from scratch, from raw sensory data, would be slow, would be expensive, would require enormous processing, would waste time and energy, much more efficient to predict, to maintain a model, to simulate what's probably there, and use sensory data only to check, to update, to correct when predictions fail. This is faster, more efficient, uses less processing, less energy, less time, enabling rapid response, rapid behavior, rapid adaptation, all based on predicted reality, modeled reality, simulated reality that usually matches actual reality, usually close enough, usually adequate for survival, for reproduction, for passing on genes, even if not perfectly accurate, even if not completely true, even if hiding aspects of reality, simplifying complexity, creating a useful illusion rather than an accurate representation. Because accuracy is not what evolution optimizes, survival is, reproduction is, genetic success is, and sometimes a useful illusion, a simplified model, a predicted reality works better than truth, than accuracy, than faithful representation of how things actually are. Now let me address evolution more directly, more explicitly, because this is crucial for understanding why perception might not reveal truth, might not show reality accurately, might be optimized for something other than accuracy, than truth, than faithful representation of objective reality. Evolution optimizes fitness, reproductive success, genetic persistence, not truth, not accuracy, not correspondence to reality. And sometimes, perhaps often, fitness and truth diverge. Evolution favors useful illusion over accurate perception, favors simple models over complex reality, favors fast heuristics over careful analysis, because reproduction doesn't require truth, doesn't require accuracy, doesn't require seeing reality as it is, only requires behavior that works, that enables survival, that leads to reproduction, that passes on genes, nothing more. Donald Hoffman has developed this idea rigorously mathematically using evolutionary game theory, showing that when fitness functions are not identical to truth functions, when what benefits survival is not the same as what's objectively true, evolution favors perception that tracks fitness, that represents what's useful, not perception that tracks truth, that represents what's real. And in simulated evolutionary competitions, organisms perceiving fitness, perceiving what benefits them, outcompete organisms perceiving truth, perceiving what's actually there, every time, consistently, overwhelmingly, because tracking fitness, responding to what benefits survival, works better than tracking truth, responding to what's actually real. When the two diverge, when reality contains information irrelevant to survival, contains complexity unnecessary for reproduction, contains truth that doesn't affect fitness. So evolution might actively hide reality, actively prevent accurate perception, actively favor illusion, not because illusion is better in general, but because a useful illusion, a fitness-tracking illusion, a survival-optimizing illusion works better than truth for reproductive success, for genetic persistence, for evolutionary competition. And perceptual systems that evolve through natural selection, through billions of years of competition, through countless generations of optimization, might be optimized for fitness, for survival, for behavior, not for truth, not for accuracy, not for revealing reality as it is, creating a conscious experience that feels like direct access to reality, that feels immediate, obvious, true, when actually it's a useful interface, a survival tool, a fitness-tracking representation that hides truth, that simplifies complexity, that creates an illusion optimized for reproduction rather than revelation. This is disturbing, deeply disturbing. It means your senses, your perception, your conscious experience might be actively misleading, might be evolved to hide reality, might be optimized to prevent you from seeing truth, from experiencing reality as it actually is, because truth didn't benefit your ancestors, didn't help them survive, didn't increase reproductive success. What helped was a simplified model, a useful representation, a fitness-tracking interface that enabled rapid behavior, efficient response, successful reproduction, while hiding complexity, while simplifying truth, while creating an illusion that worked better than reality for passing on genes. Let me talk about physics now, about how modern physics reveals a reality radically different from perception, radically incompatible with conscious experience, radically beyond what human intuition can grasp. Because this demonstrates most clearly, most undeniably, that perception does not reveal reality, that consciousness does not access truth, that human experience is not a guide to how the universe actually works. At the fundamental level, at the deepest description, at the level of quantum fields and space-time curvature and information and entropy, none of it is accessible to perception, none of it is represented in consciousness, none of it is part of the model brains build. All hidden, all beyond experience, all requiring mathematics, measurement, careful reasoning to discover, to understand, to describe, because perception shows none of it, consciousness reveals none of it. Direct experience contains no hint of quantum superposition, space-time curvature, field theory, entropy gradients, none of the deep structure of reality. All hidden, all inaccessible to perception, all requiring tools, mathematics, science to overcome the limitations of consciousness, to transcend the boundaries of perception, to access reality beyond the model brain's build, beyond the interface evolution created, beyond the useful illusion optimized for survival rather than truth. Quantum mechanics describes reality as fundamentally probabilistic, as existing in superpositions, multiple states simultaneously until measurement, until observation, creating definite outcomes, classical states, the world of experience. But this is not how perception works, not how consciousness operates, not what you experience directly. You never see superpositions, never experience quantum uncertainty, never perceive probabilistic reality. Your consciousness shows you a definite world, classical objects, specific states, clear outcomes, always, consistently, never revealing the underlying quantum nature, never showing the wave functions, the probability amplitudes, the superpositions, all hidden, all processed out, all collapsed, before consciousness accesses information, before perception builds experience, before awareness creates a world of definite objects and clear states that seems obviously real, obviously fundamental, obviously how things are, when actually it's emergent, a classical limit, a measurement outcome, a result of a quantum process, but not the process itself, not the underlying reality, not the deeper truth. Just the interface, the user-friendly display, the conscious experience that hides quantum nature, that presents the classical world, that creates the illusion of definiteness when reality is probabilistic, the illusion of clarity when reality is uncertain, the illusion of objects when reality is fields, all hidden by perception, all simplified by consciousness, all presented as an obvious classical world, when the actual universe at the fundamental level is nothing like this, nothing like experience shows, nothing like perception reveals, and space-time relativity shows. Space-time is relative, observer-dependent, without universal simultaneity, without absolute time, without an objective present. Different observers have different time orderings, different definitions of now, different space-time geometries near massive objects. None of this is in perception. None of this is in consciousness. None of this is in direct experience. You experience absolute time, a universal now, an objective present, three-dimensional space and separate time. Exactly what relativity shows is wrong, is not how reality works, is not the structure of space-time, but perception gives you this anyway, creates this experience, builds this model, because absolute time, universal simultaneity, three-dimensional space, these are useful. These enable behavior. These work for organisms moving slowly, living in weak gravity, existing in a narrow range where relativistic effects are negligible, where a classical approximation works, where the Newtonian picture is adequate. So evolution built perceptual systems, built conscious experience, using a classical picture, using Newtonian assumptions, using absolute time and three-dimensional space, because it works, because it's useful, because it enables survival, not because it's true, not because it matches reality, not because space-time actually works this way, but because a useful illusion, a simplified model, a classical approximation was good enough, was adequate, was better than truth for reproductive success in ancestral environments. Now, let me address the hard problem of consciousness, the mystery of subjective experience, of qualia, of why physical processes in the brain create conscious experience at all, why there is something it is like to be you, to have experiences, to perceive colors and sounds and sensations. Why isn't the brain just processing information without consciousness, without awareness, without subjective experience? Why does it feel like something? Why is there inner life? Why does consciousness exist? This is the hard problem, unsolved, perhaps unsolvable, perhaps fundamentally mysterious, because consciousness is unlike anything else in physics, unlike any other phenomenon, unlike any other physical process. Consciousness is subjective, first person, accessible only to the being having the experience. You know what it's like to see red, to hear music, to feel pain, but you can't communicate this, can't transfer this, can't give someone else your experience, your qualia, your subjective awareness. You can describe it, can point to similarities, can use analogies, but you can't make someone else experience what you experience, know what you know, feel what you feel from the inside, from the first-person perspective, from subjective awareness. And we don't know why, don't know how physical processes create subjective experience. Don't know why neurons firing, chemicals flowing, electrical signals propagating, create consciousness, create awareness, create the feeling of being, of experiencing, of having inner life. This is mysterious, profoundly mysterious, perhaps fundamentally mysterious, because consciousness might be different, might be special, might be irreducible, not explainable in terms of physics, not derivable from brain processes, not understandable as a computational function, but fundamental, basic, an irreducible aspect of reality that emerges, that appears, that manifests when information is processed in certain ways, in certain structures, with certain complexity, creating something new, something unique, something that physics alone cannot explain, cannot predict, cannot derive from equations, creating an explanatory gap, the hard problem, the mystery of why consciousness exists at all, why there is subjective experience, why physical processes produce awareness rather than just behavior, just computation, just information processing, without consciousness, without experience, without it feeling like something to be the system doing the processing. And if consciousness is fundamental, if subjective experience is irreducible, if awareness is a basic feature of reality, then perception, experience, consciousness itself might be even more separated from reality than neuroscience suggests. Might be not just a constructed model, but something entirely different, something that doesn't correspond to external reality at all, something that creates its own reality, its own world, its own domain, entirely within consciousness, entirely subjective, with no direct connection to external physical reality, only an indirect connection through causal chains, through sensory input affecting brain states, affecting conscious experience, but with consciousness itself being private, internal, subjective, creating a world of experience that exists only for the experiencer, only in awareness, only in the model consciousness builds, that might not correspond to anything external, anything objective, anything beyond subjective experience itself. Let me end with a reflection on what this means for you, for your life, for your experience, for everything you have ever perceived, ever experienced, ever believed about reality, about the world, about what exists. All of it constructed, all of it a model, all of it interpretation created by your brain using limited information, using algorithms optimized for survival, using processing shaped by evolution, generating an experience that feels immediate, direct, true, when actually it's mediated, constructed, a model rather than reality. You have never seen reality, never touched it, never experienced it directly. Everything you have ever perceived, every color and sound and object and moment, every sensation and emotion and thought and experience, all of it has been inside your consciousness, inside the model your brain builds, inside the constructed representation that feels like the world but is actually just interpretation, just processing, just a model, created from sensory signals, from information, from patterns your brain detects, organizes, transforms into experience, into the seamless, unified, coherent, conscious awareness you think of as perceiving reality, as experiencing the world, as seeing what's actually there, when actually you're seeing construction, model, representation built by your brain for survival, for behavior, for reproduction, not for truth, not for accuracy, not for revealing reality as it is, but for enabling genes to persist, for allowing organisms to function, for creating behavior adequate for reproductive success in ancestral environments. Nothing more, nothing less. And reality itself, objective reality, the universe as it actually exists, independent of observers, independent of consciousness, independent of perception, might be completely different, radically different, unimaginably different from anything you have ever experienced, anything you can imagine, anything accessible to consciousness, because consciousness shows you only a model, only an interface, only a representation optimized for fitness, for survival, for behavior, not for truth, not for accuracy, not for correspondence to reality. And the actual universe, the real external world, the objective structure of existence, might be so alien, so strange, so unlike anything in experience that human minds cannot comprehend it, cannot perceive it, cannot access it. Even with science, even with mathematics, even with the best tools, the deepest theories, the most careful measurements, because human minds evolved for a different purpose, a different function, a different optimization, creating a consciousness fundamentally limited, fundamentally bounded, fundamentally incapable of directly perceiving reality, of accessing truth, of experiencing the universe as it actually is. Perhaps the greatest illusion humans ever believed was the feeling that they directly experience reality itself. That perception shows them the world. That consciousness gives them access to truth, to objective reality, to what actually exists. When actually consciousness gives them only a model, only a representation, only a constructed interpretation built by the brain from limited information using algorithms optimized for survival rather than truth, creating an experience that feels immediate and direct and obvious and true, when actually it's mediated and constructed and simplified and useful for behavior, useful for survival, useful for reproduction, but not true, not accurate, not corresponding to reality, not showing the universe as it is, just showing what brains evolved to show, what consciousness evolved to experience, what perception evolved to reveal, which might be entirely different from truth, entirely different from reality, entirely different from the universe as it actually exists, independent of observers, independent of consciousness, independent of the constructed models brains build and call perception, call experience, call reality, when actually it's an illusion, a useful illusion, a survival, optimized illusion, created by evolution, maintained by brains, experienced by consciousness, that never once, not even for a single moment, not even accidentally, directly perceived the true structure of reality. Human beings may spend their entire lives trusting their senses completely, believing perception is accurate, believing consciousness reveals truth, believing experience shows reality, while never once directly perceiving the true structure of reality, never accessing the objective universe, never experiencing the world as it actually is, only experiencing a model, a representation, a construction that brains build, that consciousness experiences, that feels like reality but is only interpretation, only an interface, only a useful fiction, optimized for survival, shaped by evolution, limited by biology, creating an experience that works, that enables behavior, that supports reproduction, but that might be completely, radically, fundamentally different from the truth, from reality, from the universe as it actually exists, beyond perception, beyond consciousness, beyond the reach of minds that evolved to survive rather than to understand, to reproduce rather than to know, to persist rather than to perceive truth, leaving humans forever trapped, forever bounded, forever limited inside a constructed reality, inside a perceptual model, inside a conscious experience that feels like truth but might be nothing more than the most elaborate, the most convincing, the most pervasive illusion evolution ever created, making you believe you see reality when you have never seen it at all.